I'm Scott Leadingham. Thanks for joining us here in the unique Northwest. Here's a weird question. You ever buy blueberries? I know, something you didn't think you would hear on TV, but blueberries are undergoing an interesting supply and demand and economics lesson in the Northwest. And someone who reports on the economics of agriculture is our own Anna King. Thanks for joining us today, Anna.
Hi, Scott.
So, Anna, let's jump right into this big barrel of blueberries. Why are we suddenly concerned about their supply?
So basically, there's a lot of imports from Canada, Mexico, Chile, and now Peru, putting the squeeze on American farmers. This same thing happened in the asparagus industry that I covered closely. And now a lot of those big processors are overseas. So it can have some really grave effects.
And one thing that I didn't realize in the course of your recent reporting on this was that how large the blueberry industry really is in the United States, and particularly Oregon and Washington. In fact, I just sort of conceptually thought most of it happened on the west side of the Cascades. It's rainy or better weather for that sort of a crop. But in fact, there's a lot on the east side of the Cascades. So, and for the purposes of a little prop here, I went out and bought my first, is it called a clamshell of blueberries? I don't think I've ever bought one of these before, but they are grown in Oregon, it says on the label. So can you please just explain a little bit, one, how big really is the industry in the Northwest, and how long and how big is it on the east side of the Cascades?
Yeah, so just this last year, Washington grew 160 million pounds of blueberries. Oregon grew about the same this year. And to give a sense of scale of growth for the industry, Oregon's blueberry industry has grown over 300% in the last few years, and Washington by 800%. And so now, growers figured out kind of how to grow blueberries on the east side of the state. And so to do that, they need more heat units, which Eastern Washington has. They use shade cloth tents many times to shade the blueberries so they don't get overexposed to the sun, and to protect them from some pests. And there's fewer insects over here, so they can grow organic blueberries a little bit easier over here. And then they have this little acidic drip that they put in the drip lines for the irrigation to make the soil a little bit more acidic, which the berries like. And then there's a lot of room and a lot of farmers out here. So that's why we're growing a lot of blueberries east of the Cascades.
Right, that makes sense. So it's not just apples and wheat and some of those and potatoes in central Washington, lots of blueberries as well. So I will remember that the next time I'm at the store and I need something to put into my oatmeal, I suppose, or yogurt, whatever blueberries complement well. But this issue that you've been reporting on in terms of the pressure from other countries and their imports isn't unique just to blueberries. You mentioned asparagus before, and that there's a big crash or a big effects on the asparagus market in the Northwest from several years ago. Remind us of what happened there.
Yeah, around 10, 15 years ago, America put this program in place to help farmers in Central America farm other stuff instead of drugs, is what the program was intended to do. What happened is that they became very good at growing asparagus, and they started importing that asparagus to one of the top markets, America, for asparagus. And so that really put a hamper on the American industry. Now, what also happened is big companies like Seneca and Green Giant said, why are we packing asparagus up here where it's more expensive when we can go down to South America, pack it much cheaper, and then just import it? So a lot of the big processing plants, like in Dayton, Washington, for instance, closed up, shuttered, and went down to South America. Now the industry for asparagus in Washington, which was one of the largest in the country, is now much, much smaller. It's only a fresh industry mostly, with a little bit of packing or pickling, but not nearly to the scale that it used to be. And it's really hard to cover that. I covered that industry for about 10 years as it was collapsing. And it was a tough story to do because every farmer I would talk to was just in dire straits and they had to close their family farm. And it was just really heart-wrenching.
I bet so, for people whose livelihood it depends on. But, I don't think I've ever actually had fresh asparagus, maybe pickled asparagus in my Bloody Mary. So maybe that suggests I should branch out into actually fresh produce more often, but that's another story. So changing gears, you also cover a lot of Hanford there in the Tri-Cities. And there was recently a story about federal contractors at Hanford and a big settlement they had to pay with the U.S. government for some of the labor costs that they've been billing. Tell us more about those contractors and what they had to pay.
Yeah, managers at two big contractors that build the plant at Hanford, or a large factory at Hanford, agreed to pay a very large fine, millions and millions of dollars. That's because they were charging for hours not worked. In other words, time card fraud. And it was pretty widespread within those companies. It's a big deal because this plant has had many problems over the years as it's being built, and whistleblowers have said that it's not safe. In fact, one massive part of the plant, the pre-treatment facility for high-level waste, has been mothballed, and workers and engineers are trying to come up with a better plan or a plan to make that plant safer.
And so just to remind, this specifically was related to one of the many things being built or being worked on at Hanford. Of course, Hanford isn't just one particular reactor or decommissioned thing. There's a bunch of things. This story, as it related to these contractors, was on their work specifically about what's called the vitrification plant, or the VIT plant for short. Remind us, what is that plant, when it's eventually supposed to be done, going to do, and why is it it's something like 20 years just to build the actual facility? Why so long?
Hanford is huge. Just to step back for a moment, it's 586 square miles of earth nestled along the reaches of the Columbia River. There's hundreds of hazardous sites that have to be cleaned up within Hanford. And the vitrification plant is a massive complex of buildings that the Department of Energy is building to treat millions and millions of gallons of radioactive sludge and get that sludge into a safer configuration and away from the river. They want to make it into big glass logs, is what this factory will do. They've been designing it and building it for about 20 years. But as I said, it's been very controversial, and it's taken longer and cost more than most people have ever expected.
Well, it's good information. And we know that Hanford, of course, is not going away anytime soon. And you will be out there reporting on a lot of the nuances, and agriculture in the Northwest also not going away. So you will be out there reporting on all of those topics. Thanks for joining us today, Anna.
Thanks for having me, Scott.
We now turn to correspondent Courtney Flatt in the Tri-Cities. It seems the more things change, the more they remain the same. And in that regard, we are once again going to talk about the Snake River dams in southeastern Washington, a topic that Courtney covers very closely. So, Courtney, why are these dams once again in the news?
This was the final stage of this particular plan that officials have been working on for 4 years. It finalizes their preferred plan for the maintenance and operation of the Columbia River system, which includes the lower Snake River dams. And as you may recall, tribal members, environmental groups, fish advocates all wanted the dams to be removed or altered, and that didn't happen. One big thing that this plan does do is continue a flexible spill agreement. And what that is it will allow more water to be spilled over the tops of dams as young salmon migrate out to the Pacific Ocean, or the water can be moved through the dam turbines to generate electricity as it's needed.
And as with anything, this is likely going to still wind up in court or generate some pushback and potential lawsuits. So what is the next step for dam advocates dam removal advocates and people who want to protect salmon? Is there anything that they're saying they will do?
Yes, well, environmental attorneys have already pointed out that there are very few differences between this plan and the plan from 4 years ago, which wound up in court. That plan in 2016, a federal judge reviewed it and said it wasn't doing enough to protect salmon and sent it back to the drawing board. And he ordered that the removal or the alteration of the Snake River dams be looked at seriously. So it very, very likely could wind up back in court. But beyond that, groups who want the dams to be removed are pushing Congress and regional governors to get involved. For one thing, Governor Kate Brown of Oregon has said she supports removing the earthen portion of the dams. In Washington, it might seem like a lifetime ago, but this past January, there were panels across the state where people discussed ways to save the salmon, but also not harm the economy. And those panels came out of recommendations of a task force that Governor Jay Inslee put together. That task force was looking at how to save the southern resident orcas in Puget Sound. And those might not seem linked, but the orcas depend on salmon for food. So some people say that what happens to the salmon will greatly affect what happens to the orcas. One other thing that is also happening that's kind of new is there's a tribal coalition forming. It's called the Northwest Salmon Tribal Alliance. And one of their big pushes is to restore the lower Snake River. They say that the US government is not holding up its treaty obligations to have abundant and harvestable salmon.
So ultimately, if these dams were to be removed or altered, it would take an act of Congress. And it's notable that the two members of Congress who represent this region, Dan Newhouse in Washington's 4th District and Kathy McMorris Rodgers to the east in Washington's 5th District, are both heavily on record as being opposed to any sort of dam removal. And this issue has come up in past election seasons, and it is currently coming up in this election season. So just remind us of what generally those two members of Congress have said on the issue.
Yeah, so Representatives Dan Newhouse and Kathy McMorris Rodgers have made it no secret that they would like to keep the dams in place. They say it's very important for our regional economy, and it's needed to generate clean energy. After this particular decision, Newhouse said that the dams, quote, make our way of life possible. And by that, he was referring to agriculture. Kathy McMorris Rodgers called the dams essential to our region. And she praised the Trump administration for making this sort of thing a priority. The administration had sped up the decision that just came out by about a year. So I would say it might be hard for people who want the dams to be removed to convince these particular Congress members that that should be the end goal.
Well, it's all good information, and we thank you for sharing it, Courtney.
Thanks for having me, Scott.
You can find more information on these stories, coronavirus updates or resources, and election news at our website, NWPB.org. Thank you for joining us here in the unique Northwest.